I want to talk about imagery in poetry. That is what we are discussing in our unit for this week. Now, imagery in poetry has a rather obvious purpose. The image in the poem makes abstraction, thought, feeling concrete so that the poem can strike our five senses and therefore animate us with the idea or feeling that the poet wishes to express. Poems have always had images. You can study any literature at any time and you will find poets using images, often very striking, unexpected images. In fact, those are the images that tend to be the most powerful, are those that escape cliche, that escape familiarity, and that, to use the words of a famous Russian literary theorist, that defamiliarize the familiar. Images that show us the world we recognize, like the world of trees and grass, but describe the trees and grass in such a way that we're almost seeing them for the first time. Now, I want to talk today about a specific literary movement of the early 20th century because I feel that this movement, called aptly Imagism, will help us think about how images function in the works of these imagists, but also will help us think about imagery in general. We'll think about imagery in poems and in other literary periods, even in other languages. So we've looked at some of these poets already in our class, so some of these poems will be familiar to you, and that's a good thing. And I've talked about some of these ideas in class, and so they will be familiar to as well, and that is also a good thing. So, American poet Ezra Pound, early part of the 20th century, developed a school of poetry that he called Imagism. And he published an anthology of Imagist poetry in 1914 titled Des Imagistes, the Imagists. He liked to use the French. And luckily for us, he, in his prose, defined exactly what he thought a poetic image should do. So I'm going to share some of that with you right now. We need to realize that Pound, in creating Imagism, was very much in rebellion against certain tendencies he saw in 19th century English poetry. He saw a tendency to abstraction, poets not showing a beautiful dawn with images, but poets simply saying it's a beautiful dawn, say. He was also he was concerned too with how poetry tended to follow set metrical patterns for no necessary reason. Poet might say, oh, well, I know that good poetry should be written in iambic pentameter, so I'm going to do that. Well, Pound was frustrated with that as well, believing that the meter of the poem should grow out of the content of the poem, that each poem had its own particular meter, not that poems should fit into one primary meter. So these are the two primary problems Pound had with 19th century English poetry, abstraction and set metrical pattern. Pound also had trouble with another literary movement that flourished in the 19th century, the French symbolists movement. The French symbolist movement, people like Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Verlaine, writing some of them into the 20th century, he was frustrated by their imbuing of things with a kind of mysticism. So for a symbolist, the image wouldn't necessarily be something that one could attach to the actual world, but the image would be a symbol of a kind of esoteric idea or feeling of the poet. And was meant to function almost like a religious symbol, not a religious symbol of a traditional religion, but a religion of art, if you will. Then you could meditate on this symbol, and you could feel kind of the sacredness of language and the sacredness of art. Pound found that the French symbolists were, again, making images too esoteric, too personal, and not really connecting the images to the actual physical world. So, with this context in mind, Pound, early 20th century, around the 1913, 14, thereabouts, said an image should be a direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. And one should use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. So instead of trying to be indirect or digressive, the poet should simply present the image. This is it, in as few words as possible. So there's a great minimalism, a great concision, a great condensation to Imagism. In fact, a primary influence on Imagism is the tradition of the Japanese haiku poem. Haiku poem in Japanese is a 17-syllable poem. The first line has 5 syllables, next line 7, next line 5. And the haiku usually is simply a direct image that has an emotional vibration to it, if you will. The 17th century Japanese poet Matsui Basho is the most famous, probably, of the traditional haiku writers, and his most famous, perhaps, haiku is Old Pond, Frog leaps in, Water's sound. Direct, minimal, objective, a perfect example of what Pound says when he tells us to treat things directly, whether subjective or objective, and to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. He elaborates, we should use no superfluous word, no adjective which does not reveal something. Don't use such an expression as dim lands of peace. It dulls the image. It mixes an abstraction with the concrete. It comes from the writers not realizing that the natural object is always the adequate symbol. Go in fear of abstractions. Do not retell in mediocre verse what has already been done in good prose. Now, a lot of these precepts influenced 20th century poetry and continues to influence 21st century poetry. So a lot of the contemporary poets we've been reading are writing in this way, meaning writing as concisely as possible and presenting images as sharply as possible. So this language may not strike you as odd, but at the time when Pound was writing it, it was novel. Now, so he's talking about content, if you will, but he also talks about the form of the poem. He says, as regarding rhythm, to compose in the sequence of the musical phrase, not in the sequence of the metronome. In other words, don't say, I will write in iambic pentameter, just because that's been the meter that English poets have used from almost the early modern period on. Instead, each poem, based on its subject matter, has its own rhythm, as Pound says. I believe in an absolute rhythm, a rhythm that is in poetry which corresponds exactly to the emotional or shade of emotion to be expressed. A man's rhythm must be interpretive. It will be, therefore, in the end, his own uncounterfeitable. In other words, each image I use should suggest a particular rhythm. So Pound is talking here about free verse, meaning that I will not use set rhythms. I will not use any set pattern, but the feeling or the idea surrounding the image I'm making should suggest the music or the meter or the rhythm of the poem. Now, around this time, one of Pound's contemporaries, Amy Lowell, was also a practicing Imagist poet, and she published in 1915 her own anthology called Some Imagist Poems. Now, she and Pound were friends initially and had a break. Won't go into that, but it is useful to read her precepts for imagism. They complement Pound's, but also they might offer a kind of freshness and depth that we didn't see necessarily in the Pound precepts I just described. Here's what she says, and I'm quoting part of the time and I'm paraphrasing part of the time. She says, "Use language of common speech." Pound tended to be kind of elitist and hierarchical in his thinking, and wasn't as open to common speech, we might say, as someone like Lowell. So use common speech. Write in the same kind of speech you would speak in. Don't write something you would not say. George Orwell offers the same advice for prose writing. She says also, create new rhythms as the expression of new moods. Lean toward free verse. So create new rhythms, a new rhythm for each new poem. Each poem should have its own rhythm. Absolute freedom in the choice of subject. You can write about whatever you want. Maybe in the 19th century there were certain subjects you just wouldn't write about, like sex, unless you're Walt Whitman. But you can write about anything you want to. Just as we're breaking away from conventions in verse, we should also break away from conventions in what's appropriate and not in poetic subject matter. Present an image, render particulars exactly. Don't deal in vague generalities. Produce poetry that is hard and clear, never blurred nor indefinite. Hard and clear, never blurred, definite. Believe that concentration is the very essence of poetry. So most Imagist poems, and we're going to look at some now. We're going to look at one by Pound that we've seen before. We're going to look at one by Lowell. And if we have time, we'll look at one by H.D. and we'll look at one by William Carlos Williams. But you'll notice that Imagist poems tend not to be in first person. They tend to be in third person, as if there's not a subject there. This is a divergence from a lot of 19th century poetry. And one might say this is a limitation of the Imagist poem. I mean, a pure Imagist poem is often just that image and nothing else. There's no I expounding or interpreting. There's no I being self-conscious about what's going on. So even though imagism can help us understand the power of poetic imagery, I'm certainly not a proponent of your or anyone writing only Imagist poems. I'm simply using this as an example. The kind of poetry I tend to like Frank O'Hara's poetry or Walt Whitman's poetry, tends to be very loose and digressive, paratactical, playful. Yes, there are striking images. You'll see striking images in Whitman's poem and O'Hara's poetry, but the images are part of some kind of larger vision of a self in motion. Enough about that. So the most famous Imagist poem is Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro. Metro being the underground system in Paris. And Pound says he wanted to write a poem about a sight he had, an experience he had one twilight of people coming out of the metro. And he initially wrote a poem of 30 lines, but he kept revising it and revising it and revising it until eventually he had it down to 2 lines. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So this is simple, this is graspable, but it's also very rich at the same time. He uses apparition instead of appearance, suggesting there is something ghostly about these people, almost as if they may be souls from the underworld in Greek mythology, coming up from the underworld, suggesting death. But then the petals on a wet black bough, it's interesting that apparition equals petals. There's no verb here. The apparition of these faces in the crowd basically equals petals on a wet black bough. So ghostly apparition is somehow a damp flower petal. Death and life somehow come together. And this moistness is also on the bough branch. Does that mean, is the branch fallen? Is the branch not fallen? Is this further death? Is it life? Or is this branch reminiscent of the golden bough that Aeneas had to recover to gain access to the underworld? So all I'm saying is that these two lines, easily graspable, simply an image, it's almost like a painting, has rich emotional texture, suggesting this kind of tension between life and death, growth and decay, the modern world and the ancient world. Now, Amy Lowell has an Imagist poem called A Year Passes. It goes like this. Beyond the porcelain fence of the pleasure garden, I hear the frogs in the blue-green rice fields, but the sword-shaped moon has cut my heart in two. There's more subjectivity here. There is an I here. We didn't see that in the Pound poem, but the poem really operates based on its images. Beyond the porcelain fence of the pleasure garden. Think of porcelain as something kind of white and fantastical and beautiful, opening up to a pleasure garden. There's something very exotic about this. We might think of the pleasure dome in Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan. Something very artificial, again, beautiful, exotic perhaps. And the speaker hears frogs in the blue-green rice field. So there's a suggestion here that the frogs are from outside the pleasure garden. They're from the rice fields, and the speaker's imagining these blue-green rice fields. We can see them so well, right? Again, the striking image. But the sword-shaped moon. Now we asked to look up at the moon to go from hearing to sight has cut my heart in two. So we get from this beautiful pleasure garden to these frogs croaking in the distance, to the sword-shaped moon cutting the speaker's heart in two. So the poem moves from what seems to be pleasure to a sense of sorrow. And the question is, why is there sorrow? Well, the poem begins with beyond the porcelain fence of the pleasure garden. I hear the frogs in the blue-green rice fields. Beyond the porcelain fence is the speaker beyond the porcelain fence? Is the speaker outside the pleasure garden? Or are the frogs beyond the porcelain fence outside the pleasure garden? It's ambiguous. So it becomes a poem about longing, maybe longing to get out of a confined artificial space, or maybe a longing to get in a confined artificial space. We could continue discussing this poem, but suffice it to say, like Pound's poem in A Station at the Metro, it's concise, it's direct, it's simple, easily graspable on the surface, but yet it carries complicated emotions, compelling tensions. So we remember perhaps two other great examples of imagistic poetry would be H.D. Hilda Doolittle's Oread, about an Oread or a forest nymph who is beholding the sea and imagines the sea turning into trees. And we remember The Red Wheelbarrow by W.C. Williams. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow near the chickens glazed in rain, paraphrasing. But those are other poems that exemplify imagism. So, to conclude, the images in the imagistic school are concrete, minimal, concise, accessible, but yet they carry emotional and intellectual depth at the same time. And this is what haiku can do, and we'll be looking at some haiku. So as we are studying imagery this week, we're studying haiku exclusively tomorrow. We'll be looking at other poetry on Friday. Let's just keep asking ourselves, how is this image functioning in this poetry? One. And two, is this the kind of image that an imagist would celebrate or not? And what would we think about that certainly, as I said, the Imagist way of thinking about images is simply that, one way. And there are other ways to think about images, and perhaps we'll find imagery in poetry that's quite different from the kind of imagery we've just witnessed in the Pound poem and the Lowell poem. And maybe we'll think that other kind of imagery is fantastic. We'll see how it goes.